Sego, and welcome to Let's Talk. Let's Talk Native. I'm sorry. I'm trying to pull my there we go. Yeah, there we go. Well, welcome to Let's Talk Native on this Tuesday, July 9th. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We don't do prayers or buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity. When we may step on a few toes along the way, but our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We'll take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is being heaped upon us, and we do it all right here from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. I've got Ed Schindler in studio, and we're gonna chew some issues up here a little bit. But before we even start, let me remind people that our audio streams at www.letstalknative.com. We stream video of the show live on Facebook Live. We take the audio and we put it up on SoundCloud, which also puts it up on any and all of your favorite podcast platforms. We take video of the show and we post it up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. And I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel. We just posted, in fact, I say we, it's Jake. Jake just posted a whole bunch of videos of some of the performances by Jeff Doreen and Laura Coogee at my last event in New York City at the Brooklyn Commons. Broke out a couple of the individual songs, a couple of their performances, and I encourage you to take a look at them. Please enjoy them. And remember, if you're, somebody just said, geez, I wish I knew what the translations were. I'm thinking, well, if you don't know Beatles tunes, you can find the lyrics online easy enough. So if you're wondering what is Jeff saying when he's singing these Beatles tunes in Mohawk, or even the Dave Matthews tune that he does, look, you can find the lyrics, and you'll have a perfectly good English translation of what he is singing in Mohawk. So again, we got a bunch of those videos up there. Of course, we post all the videos of the shows that we do here and the ones we do in New York, and we do some short form videos like the one that is getting some pretty good hits. The one we did on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I call it RBG on the DOD. I know it sounds catchy, right? It sounds like I could do a rap song on that. I won't try that. But no, Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. So do check it out. And look, share these things. And if you share them on Twitter, make sure that you tag some of the folks that you would like to specifically to hear these things. And if you share them on Facebook, make sure you tag some folks too. But we look for your comments. And look, I get it. Not all comments are going to be favorable. Like I said, I know we step on a few toes along the way. So, but I think these are conversations that need to be had. I'm willing to have them. And at the risk of, never quite being that popular radio host that, that some people achieve, I've got a targeted audience. I'm not trying to compete with kitten videos, or, cute little videos of squirrels surfing or anything like that. I'm trying to reach out to our people and the people who are genuinely interested in some of these Native issues that we talk about. So, look, I'm the host of Let's Talk Native. I'm assisted by Jake Proud here in studio, who's managing our audio and our sound, our audio and our video. Audio is sound, yeah. Our video and our sound, and of course, like I said, I've got Ed Schindler in studio. And Ed, you and I, we went to lunch this week, and we kind of had an interesting conversation about customs and tradition.
Yeah.
And you asked the question. You said, "Yeah, when does something become a tradition? How far back do you have to go?" And
Yes.
And as a kind of a post of a promo of the show, I asked that question. I mean, how far back do we have to go before before some people believe that something is a tradition? Arguably, some people believe that drinking has become such a big part of who we are, historically even. I mean, let's face it, they used alcohol as an inducement for treaty negotiations. It used to be, requisition wagon loads of rum or gin or whatever else, that they would use these as part of their treaty negotiation strategies. But alcohol clearly has become a major part of our lives, problematic as it is. I mean, and there are some people who think, oh, drinking and native, that goes hand in hand. I'm not willing to accept that. I will accept that it certainly is in our lives, and of course now we can expand that the substance abuse associated with alcohol to other substances. But there are other things. Church. Patriarchy, male dominance. I mean, we know that when the Europeans came, they brought things like, like alcohol. They brought things like disease, which we didn't necessarily embrace the disease, but we did embrace at some level alcohol. We embraced some of their Christian ideologies. Too many men embraced the male patriarchy and the male dominance culture. That's how we have today, where people will oftentimes refer to a chief system as opposed to a clan system. That's a clear indication of how patriarchy and male dominance has even crept into what we consider our traditions, right? So I don't know if you want to go on this a little bit, but this whole idea of when something becomes a tradition or a custom, and does it ever become a part of our culture? I don't know. What do you think?
One of the things I think people should realize is that a lot of things that we bring up are quite contradictory to what used to be historically and within the communities. Okay? And like drinking. At one time, you got to realize there wasn't drinking at this level. And that there's going to have to be an understanding, research and understanding as to how did it become that way? Okay. What was it before then? Okay. Those types of things are really, really trying to address the concept of identity. What makes us who we are? And I think that's really something we can get into.
Well, and I think, to that point, when you talk about some things coming in that are contradictory, I often talk about this notion and this concept of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what that is. It's when we adopt a practice or, a philosophy that is really contradictory to our core values, or we hang on to a core value even though we know, when white people use the expression cognitive dissonance, they're oftentimes talking about how people will hang on to a value system that is contradicted by facts, by science.
Yes.
And for us, I'm taking a little bit different approach to this notion of it's the same thing. It's the same conflict and the tensions that are created by a core value that we associate to our culture. But now, because of this notion of customs and tradition that aren't quite a part of our cultural identity, but they have become part of a practice in our lives for so long that many people do. Enlistment in the military service, for instance. Think about that. There are people who say, "Well, it's my family tradition. I'm a third or fourth or fifth generation." People talk about, I had family that served in the Civil War. Or maybe they'll even try to connect it all the way back to the Revolutionary War or whatever else. But you'll hear people who enlist in the U.S. military and say, "Well, I'm third or fourth generation military," and so for them, that's their family tradition. But it only became that after a fashion. At some point, the United States was our enemy. Clearly that's the case. We whether we fought directly or our people fought directly against the colonists in their attempt to free themselves from the monarchy of Europe. Clearly, we have had these conflicts with the United States for many generations, and yet we adopt this sense of patriotism. Almost this. What do they call it? Stockholm syndrome, I guess you could call it. So, I guess this is where I want to chew some of this stuff up and I'm not just condemning military service, and I'm not even necessarily just condemning the church. But some of the things that come with that, again, patriarchy, male dominance. When we talk about some of the problems that we face today, those problems are oftentimes associated with this idea of a male hierarchy that the church reinforces, that military reinforces, and some, alcohol reinforces it.
Yes.
Because a lot of the abuse that is associated, domestic violence, comes from the use of alcohol or other substances. So I don't know. I mean, but again, this notion that we've created this detachment, this cognitive dissonance, this tension that exists with so many of us. I mean, and we can see it not just for us here, in Seneca territory, for instance, but as Seneca, as Gonyagahaga, as Haudenosaunee, as Ungwe.
Mm-hmm.
That word,
Yes.
even. I mean, that word Ungwe is this notion of being a real human being, and by real meaning a connection to the earth, to creation.
Mm-hmm.
That the reason we call ourselves that, and don't necessarily call white people or other people who aren't necessarily, that don't have the same connections we do, is just that they haven't been shaped by the thousands of years and our relationship with the earth. Instead, they come here treating land and resources as commodities, not as something that you have a relationship with, whether it's the elk or the buffalo or the caribou or the rivers or the land. We had a different sense. I'm not saying we always got everything right, but we clearly had this notion of this, again, the concept of 7 generations that allowed us to think beyond our own children.
Mm-hmm.
Or our children's children,
Or this weekend.
or the weekend. yeah. So I don't know. I mean, talk a little bit about the tensions that you see, and how some of these new traditions, have led to them.
Some of the ones that have changed.
Sure.
There were some basic skills that didn't exist within say European people, such as listening. And when you say listen, when I'm saying that, I don't mean just open your ears and hear what he says. It means understanding what is being said, and understanding how it engulfs both you and anyone else, how that all applies to each of us. And that goes to the next one of comprehension, where we understand why are we placed here on this creation. And that was within the teachings of the 7th generation. We have to learn how to be part of the creation, not to live off from it, meaning commodities, but to live within it. Okay? And why was that? Was in order to be able to take care of the teachings and help the 7th generation, so that what we did was going to be helping that coming.
And by 7th generation, we're really talking about those faces that we will never have direct contact with, because that's far enough out.
Yes.
So I mean, I think that ends up being part of that idea and that ideal system.
And that's what the people were focused on, was as a community working toward taking care of the 7th generation. In order to do so, you have to turn and learn how to be part of this creation, so that you can always pass it on, so it'll reach them. That was one big important aspect.
Well, and you mentioned it earlier. One of the things that we didn't do, we didn't treat land as a commodity. The idea that it's something that we can not only own and have personal ownership of, but that we can buy and sell, and we can, I mean, this isn't about land use. This is about a piece of paper that says you own it. That was a concept that wasn't ours, but that came from some of that European philosophy about enrichment. I have a guy in New York who calls me all the time, and what he tries to claim is that that capitalism was the answer to slavery, and I say no, just the opposite. I think slavery was one of the answers to capitalism. How people could become more enriched, create more consumables, and enrich themselves at the same time. Consumerism, when we start treating land as something that we consume, And by
Yeah.
consuming, I mean taking the value out of it, and to where it, whether through contamination or, deforestation, whether we change the landscape itself to meet a completely different standard, that fits in that again, what we did in terms of clearing land for farming and that kind of stuff was done at a different level than what white people did.
Yeah.
They immediately sought to create enough commodification of what this land could yield, so they could trade internationally, so they could get involved in enriching themselves beyond their own borders, not just letting the land take care of them, but letting the land enrich them.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of I've taught some classes, and a lot of people think how basically exploited my people were. Okay, and I've had people say that the African American, as much as they went through, they didn't go through as much as Native American. And my response to them was, well, they haven't gone through as much as the circle of life has. Look how many trees have been eliminated. Look how many animals have been destroyed. Look how many things basically that create that circle of life that we're part of. Look how many of them have been destroyed and are still being destroyed.
Well, I talk about Hawaii a lot of times on this show because
Yes.
I really identify with with the plight that the Kanaka Maoli, the traditional Hawaiians, are going through. I was listening to a program on public radio this week, and it was talking about the status of a Samoan in the American Samoa, because they aren't
Yes.
U.S. citizens. They're considered U.S. nationals, and of course that raises some issues for them. And when they were asking some of the folks, even some of the folks who thought there would be a benefit to being a U.S. citizen, they said no, they don't want it, and they didn't want it because they looked at Hawaii as or Guam or the Puerto Rico, as a cautionary tale that concerns them. But one of the things that to further the point that you're talking about, they talked about how much Hawaii's landscape changed because of the colonization that took place there, and even species that were not indigenous, whether it was cattle or whether it were certain birds or whatever. There are entire species that have been wiped out in Hawaii because of frankly because of the introduction of a non-indigenous species. So the whole ecosystem gets changed. So that's what comes not just with the idea of migration and immigration into a territory, but also this idea of treating land as a commodity. So you rather than seeing the value and what land produces, not just for us but for all of creation, if we can be short-sighted enough and ignore this concept of 7 generations, we can say, no, we're going to change it all. And I'm not just talking about building cities and blacktop and concrete. Frankly, those urban areas, as much as they are, a complete change of a landscape, those are relatively small areas compared to what farming has done. My friend Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz talked about how devastating the beef industry, the cattle industry is.
Yes.
Not just because beef is not necessarily that good for you, but because of what it does to the land and what has been done to ecosystems to accommodate, whether you're talking not just out west, Brazil, South America, China. I mean, there's so many areas of the planet that are changing because there's this, this changing of traditions, if you will, even traditional diets, to accommodate, the change on what we're willing to raise and what we're willing to live off of.
Right, and as you were saying earlier, because we've lost the responsibility of looking after the 7th generation, okay, then things such as drinking, alcoholism, drug abuse, all those types of things are not relevant to your concerns anymore because
they're temporary fixes, right?
Yeah, you're not concerned about those long-term responsibilities, and unfortunately, that's one of the things.
Well, I mean, but again, and I know people will view this in a certain way, but even things like Christianity basically doesn't. Even if people look about, okay, so what does a Christian do with their life? In terms of, if their ultimate goal is to go to heaven, and and if the thing that they're avoiding is hell, so damnation versus salvation. If those are the only two choices, they may not necessarily consider the impacts of the life that they choose on maybe on their kids, or their grandkids or great grandchildren, but not necessarily 7 generations. So even this idea of secularism versus this idea of eternal salvation can take away the responsibility that you have and the way you need to live your life. I mean, it's interesting that capitalism and even these Christian core values, they can exist in a state of cognitive dissonance too, because I mean the idea that you can promote one idealism associated with religion and adopt a completely different one. It's like the church advocating slavery, for instance. Yeah. And and the idea that you could treat a certain class of human being as if they weren't human beings.
Yeah.
So whether you're talking about Native people or Black people or or Filipinos or any people of color, and it isn't necessarily because of their color, it's because of their belief system. However, and this is where it gets challenging, you look at some of these cultures that immediately did pick up things like Christianity. I mean, I talked about the Moravians being being massacred by the Pennsylvania militia, part of the colonists, the Continental Army. But even as you look at what the Hawaiians went through, I mean, look, they were pretty much a Christian nation when they were recognized internationally in the 1840s as a sovereign nation. But it still didn't stop them from being treated as. I mean, look, the Queen Liliuokalani. When you look at what Randolph Hearst and some of these people how they promoted them, they put them down as monkeys. They had cartoons running in their papers. The Filipinos went through the same thing. The Samoans went through the same thing. And many of these had already been converted to Christianity. So this notion of Christianity doesn't save them. In many ways, it neuters them, because you get into, well, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. So even though your life can be a living hell today, you're supposed to believe that you're going to have eternal salvation if you just suck it up, I guess, and take what I mean. Look, what was it? Jeff Sessions. Then he gave some biblical quote that would lead people to believe that somehow, if a government exists, then it exists because God let it exist, and that you must obey governance. I mean, that's literally what was a Jeff Sessions quote. Before he quit the Attorney General's office. I mean, so again, this is what creates some of that cognitive dissonance as well. So when we abandon certain philosophical elements and characteristics, like our commitment to those faces we will never see.
Right.
When we start adopting this idea that we are fashioned in the likeness of God, and that our job is to rule the planet and subdue all the creatures of the earth, that's a completely different concept that was a part of who we are, and so it leaves us in a situation where now we've got, American flags all over our territories. We've got, well, not only do we have, people enlisting at a high rate, but we incorporate elements of this military service. I mean, we talked about powwows, yes. Powwows, which aren't necessarily a part of our culture, but we embraced it as almost a pan-Indian kind of, or more of a universal practice that brings Native people together. So we adopt that, and that becomes part of our tradition. But then we put a label on it and we call them veterans powwow. So not only did we bring in a pan-Indian concept, but now we've even turned it into some sort of patriotic expression of and honoring of people who served in the U.S. military, the U.S. war machine. I mean, so even those things become create a tension within many people.
Yeah, basically create celebration of
war.
They consider those things to be honorable.
Yeah.
Which is, a lot of things are honorable to a lot of different people. No problem there, understood. But it's not the same as what we, within our identity and our culture, had at one time. And therefore, as I talk about this, I say you got to look at what was it and how did it change? When did it change? What changed it?
And did it change for the better?
And was it,
an improvement?
Was it?
Hey, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break here, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more because, we talk about identity a lot on this show. So this idea of customs, traditions, and culture, because they aren't necessarily the same thing, but they all do shape our identity. So we'll talk about that more when we come back. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler. This is Let's Talk Native. We'll be right back.
I'm loving the water. Seems so calm to me. Sense is death. It should have never been. No more sense is death. Drinking water that's not clean. It should be right for all humanity to partly greed. What have we done? Put poison in the heart. What have we done to our children's future? This madness has gotta stop. This madness has gotta stop. Selling our blood, selling our souls to the very last drop.
Hey, I want to thank our sponsors before we get back into it. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to thank ERW and Eric White and his enterprises. We've got a couple other folks who sponsor and support the show. Ed Schindler is one of the guys who steps up and helps us. We're buying a few little pieces of equipment as we go, and so any of the support that we get from big donors, small donors, the folks who can contribute when they can, it all helps. We're even looking at Jake was just showing me a real great setup for studio. Maybe we'll even include a few more changes as we go. But we're trying to do more, all that we can to produce a better product. And I get it. We're having conversations that are sometimes a little difficult because history is not pretty. I get it all the time that if I talk about any of this ugly history that I'm somehow spewing hate and that I'm promoting hate. That's not the case at all. If when we talk about some of these histories and when we talk about this cognitive dissonance, if it makes you uncomfortable, it's probably not making you uncomfortable because I'm saying it. It's probably making you uncomfortable anyway. And I'm kind of shining a little bit of a light on it. So, but that's what we do here. And then, of course, we try to share these conversations. We do that by sharing the video of the show. I want to thank all of you who do that, whether you share the podcasts or the Facebook live streams or the or our YouTube videos. I thank all of you who do that. It's the way that you hear a conversation, whether you agree with it or not. I mean, that's not really the point here. I'm not trying to sell somebody my vision of the future or the past or anything else. We're just trying to have a conversation here. You talked about this notion of listening, Ed, and this idea that listening is different than just hearing the words coming out of somebody's mouth. Part of listening also has to do with understanding the perspective. Yes. Not because you need to share and gravitate towards that perspective, but to understand that perspective exists. Yes. This other thing that we talk about, empathy, the idea that you can actually feel what somebody's going through. Look, when I do my show this week in New York, I'm going to wear my "Get Over It" shirt because that is one of those expressions we hear all the time. And the problem, what's being sold to us and pushed on us is the idea that we should forget about all the bad things that have happened because they only happened in the past. Well, the problem is we face things today that are directly connected to, the words of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, the words in the U.S. Constitution. It's directly connected to some of the theological beliefs tied to various religions. Racism is oftentimes a direct result of some of these hierarchies that are created. And that's the one thing. I mean, we again, when we hear people promote something like the chief system, what they ignore is that we had a system that is essentially symbolized in the circle wampum that shows the 49 families of our peoples, right? And then the one title that is not tied to one of those families, and that's the Taradaho title. And one of the things that you oftentimes offer is that Taradaho has a responsibility not just to all of those 49 families, but to creation itself. So that's one of the things that you speak to.
Yeah, one of the things I heard when the story of Peacemaker was done was that they convinced the people, went out and tried to convince Taradaho that there was good, okay, in the circle of life, and they convinced him that all that life created what we live in, okay, and when it came down to naming the chiefs, and they were going to name him, he said, no, he'll speak for the circle of life. And that's who he represents. That's who he speaks for, according to the teachings. And in doing so, he always has someone.
He doesn't dictate over the circle of life. And so I guess getting, the point that I was kind of trying to get to is that we have a system that includes our families, the people. And those families, the definition of a family has to do with relationships.
Right.
So, I mean, and this is what we kind of, get away from when we create a hierarchy, because no longer are we talking about a circle that that wampum is even woven in to bind us together. Yeah. And it is not a binding in terms of, something, like an imprisonment, or constricting. It's about, tying us together in terms of relationships. And when we create hierarchies, and this notion that that not just kings and queens, but the same thing could be said of bishops and priests and that kind of stuff, that somebody has reached this higher level of of whether it's spirituality or power or governing control. That's where that has really led to some of, again, that cognitive dissonance that we're facing even today.
And that's one of the things that was so-called every day at one time in history for our people, okay? And obviously different peoples have gone different routes, but it's interesting to just look at things of that. And as much as it is interesting for us Native Americans, take a look at what all other people have gone through to reach this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, because obviously we are all on an evolutionary scale, you know, and we can, you know, look, we can have people view us as Jefferson did, as, you know, as merciless Indian savages, or primitive, or somehow less than human. I mean, there were senators even in the 19th century who were clearly talking about how what the challenge it was to have Native people reach this level of humanity. And so when they say that, what they're saying is that we're not human, that we haven't reached their standard for what is defined as a human being. And it's not just in the 19th century, it gets into the 20th century that we're faced with some of these challenges. And, you know, and the reality is, if you looked at our culture, not just the customs and traditions that we picked up along the way because of, you know, these outside influences, but if you look at our culture, you would find the people who were more committed to this notion of humanity than the people who were promoting civilization and what they were labeling humanity. Because for them, humanity was about this system of order and again, civilization is this idea that you're going to promote a specific social order that is, you know, that they define, where our understanding of humanity talked about what our relationship as human beings were to the rest of creation.
The rest of creation, and for a purpose. And that purpose was for the coming generations.
And again, not for the next coming of Christ, or, you know, or end of days, or any of this other stuff, but our purpose was to not only prepare the next generation, but to keep in our minds that there's a generation that we will never see, the ones that come after the generations that we see, and that we have a responsibility to them, and not just to the generations of human beings either. Yes. That's the other thing. When we talk about creation, we have a responsibility to the future generations of other parts, other elements of creation that are around us. And look, does that sound like this ominous task? No, it's really, I mean, some people can break it down to something as simple as do no harm. Well, I think there's more than just do no harm. But if that's all we did no harm, that would be a huge step up from where we're at now.
Yes,
in terms of the human race, because we haven't even begun to adopt, you know, the ideologies that would do no harm.
Yeah, and there's all these things that you look at throughout history, like the concept of private property. It doesn't exist within our historical communities because everything was created by, well, other things, whether it was Mother Earth, whether it was the thunders, whether it was the sun, but basically those created that which we needed and that which we used to be able to continue, and therefore we didn't own anything. When we grew the crops, we didn't grow the corn, the earth, the thunders, and the sun. They all helped it grow. Basically, it was from them. So therefore, we didn't have a right to claim it as ours.
Well, and
we shared it.
And it's not just the land. I mean, because it's land, air, water.
Yes.
And again, when we talk about land, air, and water, we also forget, you know, the power of the sun, energy. Yes. I mean, and the ultimate energy that we, you know, look, everything, even as we burn stuff, what we're releasing is what those plants stored in terms of sunlight energy. Yes. The ultimate source of energy is the sun. And we don't own the sun any more than we can own the moon, any more than we can own the air, own the water, or own the land. And so when we say that, the way white people interpret it is that we were primitive. That we hadn't evolved to this to the level of understanding and comprehending the land, the system of land ownership. Yet here we are. Here we are now with, you know, whether it's a Seneca Nation deed or whether, you know, it's however we deal with all these things. We have, in the interest of surviving in the world around us, we have picked up some of those same practices,
yes.
right? And and we struggle with them. So now we struggle with with the idea where are certain people going to live. We end up with these housing developments that are more like a lottery than than a right. And yet even with the massive reduction in our lands, we still have enough land for the size of our population, because not only did our lands were reduced, but our populations were reduced. And the steps that we need to take now are about how do we utilize our relationship with the resources that are around us. And I'm not even just confining us to the reservation line or whatever else people want to call it. No, I think we have to understand our relationship to land, air, and water in ways that that have been so corrupted, again, because of these customs that we've adopted into our lives.
Right.
And we need to really understand the cultural significance of what enabled us to survive for thousands and thousands of years, and go through our own evolutionary development.
Yeah.
We did cities. We congregated in large populations, and then we moved beyond that. We said, no, that doesn't work. We have gone through some of our own evolutionary development, and that's one of those things that certainly not going to teach any of that stuff in school.
Well, there's good and bad. There's the longhouses, but there's also Ganondagan. Ganondagan was developed in order to feed the people who were having bad harvests.
It was our own safety net, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if they had a bad harvest, didn't matter where, whether it was Onondaga, Akwesasne, Seneca Nation, wherever, anywhere, even beyond the Haudenosaunee, they could go to Ganondagan and get food, and feed the village, feed the people. In fact, if you were to study it, you'd find out that George Washington had that winter
Valley Forge.
Forge.
Yeah.
The way they survived it was that some Indian people took some other soldiers to Ganondagan, and they gathered the food they needed to feed each other through that winter. And that's what they were living off from, was what they had gotten from Ganondagan.
Well, and of course, the flip side of that is George Washington and his scorched earth policy. How he earned the name Randa de Gallas was because and it wasn't just George Washington was the only one. The first time Ganondagan was destroyed, and some of that was the French, right? I mean, there was I don't know how many would have been 100 years prior to that. Or more. Mm-hmm. There were the Europeans recognized that this idea that we had a food storage, a food bank essentially.
Yes.
For our folks, they knew that was one of the ways. That was the only thing that resembled their what they would consider an accumulation of wealth, and they knew to destroy it. They not just to destroy the stores, but just destroy the crops and try to damage the land in ways that it would not necessarily be that we would not be able to grow crops for a period of time. That was the effort. That was George Washington's orders to Sullivan. But no, you also mentioned something else that I think is worth noting. The Longhouse. The Longhouse wasn't. It was never just a council house. It was never a place of worship, as many people try to treat it today. Longhouses were where we lived. We had extended families. We didn't have this notion of a nuclear family. That was something that came with Christianity, came with patriarchy, because unlike, I mean, this is what made the Longhouse fail. It was because all of a sudden a man in his castle had to take precedent over the idea of living within the matrilineal system, where we lived with the woman's clan. So this extended family was the female line that would live in a longhouse, and that's what you extended that home and those people who lived there. But we threw that out because the Christian belief system, philosophy, did not embrace that idea. So So we end up becoming this nuclear family, this idea of a man's family, as opposed to a woman's line. That's another one of those things. And again,
Yes.
look, people can criticize my criticism of Christianity, but what I'm saying here, and what we're talking about with all of these things, are these traditions that we adopted that were not necessarily a part of our culture. And we can, again, if we can objectively look at it and say, did we really benefit? I mean, people were literally suggested that Native people benefited from colonization because we were taught to be civilized and we were taught to be Christians. Like somehow that reward was worth all that we had lost.
Yeah. People have to understand also that things change, but there are some things that haven't. Take, for instance, a land base. We have land bases that people don't even realize exist who are west of the Mississippi. They think everything's gone from a Native perspective. Everything's been taken. Okay? It hasn't.
The land's still there.
We still have community. And it's really interesting that the people will know each other beyond. I've been to urban areas. You don't even know the person who lives across the street.
Or same building as you.
Same building. But here, man, I've been back for, 10 days. And people are still saying, oh, you're back. How long are you going to be here? What were you doing? Just basically wanting to know what I've been doing.
But it's an embrace, right? I mean,
Yes,
I mean, this is the
very
embrace
much.
that a community has, and while I argue we need a stronger sense of community, it's not because our sense of community is completely gone. I mean, we still see elements of it, and that's an example of it. Sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is the idea that, again, when we break down, this idea of a longhouse, and all of a sudden we become the nuclear family. Now, and I was just talking to a friend of mine who works so much on the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue. She talked about this idea that we look at a family and a household, we say, well, what's going on in there's none of our business. That's not our culture. That's not where we come from. Where we come from is that's not a family and we're a separate family. We would look at the families around us as part of our family. And we have a responsibility. Paul often talks about this idea that when people say, well, what's going on in their home is none of our business. Well, if you're raising a little girl and that in that household is raising a little boy, and you're saying that the violence that's taking place in the house is none of your business, well, when your little girl ends up marrying that little boy and that's the environment he was raised in, you're going to think twice about whether that was any of your business about the violence that kid grew up in. Because that's how we perpetuate this stuff generationally. We create a generational trauma. Look, we experience plenty of that from off our territories, but because we adopt it, we incorporate the alcohol into our communities. We incorporate male patriarchy. We've adopted all of these things that came from the outside. They have an effect. And because we aren't hanging on to some of the strong enough elements of our culture that says, no, what is happening in that family does affect me. So yes, I say this idea of privacy and this idea that what happens in between in somebody else's home is none of our business. Well, I beg to differ. Look, I'm not talking about what happens, in terms of relationships. I'm not talking about, sexual issues or gender issues or gender preference. None of that stuff. I'm not talking about what happens in a bedroom. I'm saying the violence that happens. If that happens in a bedroom, then I think that's an issue. But I think these are the kinds of things that we have, again, adopted these concepts and these philosophies that were not part of our culture, and we're paying for it. That's why we have, a fairly high level of domestic violence, even in Native families. I mean, it'd be great if we could just say, well, and the only domestic violence we experience is when we have a mixed relationship. That's not true. Now, I've heard some statistics that suggest that 70% of the domestic violence that happens on what Native women experience are because of a non-Native partner. I don't even know if it's that high, but even still, that means 30% of the violence is still a Native man. And again, we have a tendency to look the other way when it's our buddy who's doing some of these bad things. So if he's a great guy, except for when he gets drinking. Well, then maybe you shouldn't drink with him. Maybe we need to reevaluate some of our customs and traditions and the things that have crept into our lives. I think these are the things. That's why I want to have this conversation, and I think we need to peel off the difference between a practice that has come into our communities and into our families, and what we really regard as a custom, a tradition, or as part of our culture.
Within, we've discussed this before, but the concept of peace. I remember it was taught that peace was basically the absence of conflict, and I went and I worked and got treatment from a Lakota man, and he helped me to understand that peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the ability to regain balance whenever you've started functioning on emotion, no matter what emotion you want to talk about. But basically, you have to regain that balance. That's where you give peace, okay? And he taught that drinking is not a problem, okay? And I was wondering about that until he said, drinking is a symptom of a problem. Drinking is basically the absence of your ability to regain your peace, regain your balance. Mm-hmm. And what used to exist within the longhouses was people would go talk to other people. And if necessary, you'd come and you'd talk to a group of people in order to resolve whatever was causing issue. Okay?
We had a responsibility to help restore balance.
That was the responsibility of the community to help restore that, yes.
And we recognized that there were some people who were skilled at that.
Yeah.
And so the idea that there are some people who could provide counsel, and that's not with a C, that's with an S, they provide that kind of counsel to a family, to an individual who might be struggling with something. This, and of course, it wouldn't necessarily, like you said, it wouldn't necessarily just be one person with that skill set. Oftentimes, you would try to bring others to the table to help resolve, because sometimes that conflict was internal, sometimes that conflict was between people.
Yeah, and you help them to understand. Again, listening, empathizing, and those types of things would help to resolve whatever it was that was causing that, and help you to get balance to do so.
Well, I mean, a popular expression now is called restorative justice. And this is where people come up with alternatives, not just to incarceration, but the alternatives to the idea of punishing somebody for committing an offense. And that's one of the examples. But the concept of restorative justice is what are you restoring? You're not really restoring justice, you're restoring balance. So it gets back to this whole idea. Maintaining peace is not just about trying to prevent any conflict from coming into your community. Look, nature is rife with conflict. I mean, not only do you have, obviously food chain issues, but you have, trees competing for sunlight. You have, areas competing for water. I mean, and I don't mean just development. I mean species that are competing for water. Nature is full of conflict. And the balancing act of nature, which is what creates ecosystems, is how how nature shares and creates this level of harmony and balance.
Yes.
Man is, almost by definition, when we consider something that is natural, the opposite of something natural is man-made.
Yes.
I mean, we literally we actually use that as an expression. So there are natural products, and then there's man-made products. How did we get ourselves so far away from the natural system that I don't know that everything created by a man or a human is necessarily unnatural, but that's where we've come because we defy nature with what we construct, what we build, how we conduct our lives. We conduct our lives in a way that defies nature.
Yeah. I was going to mention one of the things just within our language, there's no word for goodbye. Okay. Each of us are going to pass on, but the concept that's carried is that we'll meet again. And
yeah, even if it's meeting with as we return back to our mother, right?
Yes.
Hey, look, we're just about out of time. I want to remind people that you can go to our website, which is www.letstalknative.com. You can find our videos and audios and photo gallery, a bunch of stuff there. I also want to remind people that you can go to our YouTube channel. We've got a bunch of new great videos of Jeff Doreen singing Beatles tunes in Mohawk and a Dave Matthews tune as well. But we post short-form videos. We post videos of the show, and it is a way that you can not only see our videos, but you can also go to the comments at the bottom of those videos as well. And, look, I do check them. I do respond to them sometimes in ways that might create a chuckle here and there. But I do encourage people to engage with us, whether it's on Facebook, whether it's on YouTube, or whether it's on Twitter. We try to use the social media platforms to get the message out and to have these conversations. So I want to thank you for listening, and we'll catch my show in New York. I'll be in New York this week on Thursday. I'm going to talk about getting over it. So you can join me there. And of course, we'll be back here on Saturday. This is John Cade with Ed Schindler. I want to thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you soon. Yahweh.
Yahweh.
Highway 16, where did our sisters go? Highway 16, where did our sisters go? Seems like